All right, I'm Steve Wood, recovered alcoholic.
And I am Howard Eber. I am a recovered alcoholic as well.
All right, well, Howard was gracious enough to step in for me last week, and I was at a retreat, so was Billy in here too. Actually, he was a participant. Um, so it was pretty amazing. Um, but I missed you guys. I missed doing a book study. But Howard was gracious enough to close out for the second edition, and I like to lead into Doctor's opinion by looking at Howard did recovery, rates and stuff, and explained it from a perspective. But I have another perspective I want to tie in. It kind of ties into what we're doing. So if we can go to XIX, the last couple pages of um, the for the second edition, where it says it's at the bottom of the page. It says "Wow." So I'm going to read that, and then I'm going to share the screen with you guys. So it says, while internal difficulties of our adolescent period were being ironed out, public acceptance of AA grew by leaps and bounds. For there were two principal reasons: the large number of recoveries and reunited homes. These made their impressions everywhere of alcoholics who came to AA and really tried. 50% got sober at once and remained that way. 25 sobered up after some relapses. And among the remainder of those who stayed on with AA showed improvement. Over thousands came to a few AA meetings and the first decided they didn't want the program. So I'm going to share the screen and we're going to talk about these three controversial recovery rates, you would say. But so I'm gonna go all the way to Silkworth, and by starting off by looking at his recovery rates and see, he was very open to saying he had a 98% failure rate. So his success rate was 2%. And what did Silkworth basically, and we'll find out what he did, but in more detail, but pretty much he would just tell them that they had this illness and see what you can do about it. So that was the best he could do. And he said of the 2%, he wasn't even sure if they were real alcoholics, if they had the allergy obsession. So if we go to 1935 to 255, what we just read, 75%, that's 3 out of 4, so 25% failure rate. But what's interesting, Clarence Snyder, and he was a student of Bob, and very very who know about him. He's a very no nonsense AA. Some people call him the first sponsor and all that. Claimed a 93 to 97% recovery rate, and then Minnesota, which is a very interesting area, they had claimed an 83% recovery rate, and then in the 60s they were saying around 90%. In certain areas. But as you can see, the 40s and 50s are not just a program of, the thing about they're not just a program of action, but a fellowship of action as well. There was no difference between the AA fellowship and the AA Big Book. They were, it's quite different than we see today at the meetings. Very high recovery rates, and they boasted about those recovery rates. So I'm gonna show you this. Let me go over here. So this is just to look at the membership of that time, and we can compare it. You can see the recovery boom. So 1930, 35. Also, we had two members, but 1940, 14, and 112,000. It started to jump and jump and jump and jump. So is it, but still, the reason I showed it to you because the 60s still claimed a 90% recovery rate. And that's really interesting that, considering the amount of people, there was 300,000 members. Um, and and then we're going to look at the 80s in here, and you can see all of a sudden, within a 10-year period, you got 900,000, and then 1.9 million, 2.1, and it's like, and so forth. That's called the recovery boom period. Why did it boom? Because of rehabs. Rehabs took off, and I'm gonna get to that in a minute. And let me fix my screen really quick because I don't want to. View. There it goes. I'm going to go back to this, and we're gonna look at the 80s, and you see already. So in 19 in the from 80 to 87, AA did, I guess you would call it like a census report of members to find out what recovery rates were. What do they look like? Because people were complaining that the guys who have been sober since the 50s, who had 30 something years or 40s or or more, were complaining about the low amount of people staying sober and not talking about the program. So when I did the census report, it came back at 5%. And then in the mid 90s, it was done again because members didn't want to believe it. They thought it was wrong. They fought against it. And they did a more sophisticated census report. And I think that's the ones where they actually, each meeting in certain areas got actually to fill out. And it came back at 3%. So it came back in their face. And after that, AA decided that census reports was a bad idea. But in like 2000, the independent, I think it was called, published by the Alcohol Treatment Authority or something like that, they said 10%. So AA, pushed a new third party report in 2012, and they claimed 20%, and people have, looked at it that way. But what's interesting is, now, we know how big membership is. And so the question is, what happened? What caused the low recovery rates? Is, speak at the time up until, and let's go back and look at this really quick. And these days, these were all speaker meetings, basically 1 hour speakers or 2 half-hour shares. And when Dr. Bob's son, who I got to talk to years and years ago, he said that his dad boasted about it. And he talks about Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers on page 222, says, we did not need to tell him about our drinking histories at meetings back then. Frankly, we did not think it was any of your business. Besides, we already knew how to drink. What we wanted to learn was how to get sober and stay sober. So, those who spoke, they spoke on stuff like relationship with God. So here's what happened. In 1956, the American Medical Association declared alcoholism an illness, allowing hospitals to admit patients without hiding their illness, like Dr. Bob and Sister Ignacio would hide the people coming in and say, this guy's got acute gastritis or something, and, and get them in the ward. So they could actually put people in the hospitals. But then in 1958, Hazelden Foundation of Minnesota turned one of their halfway houses into, which they call guest houses, into the first rehab. So the Minnesota model was born, and they formed, the typical rehab, the spin dry. I think the spin dry in were like 50 days or so, but it was basically what we see, today, the 28 model inpatient rehab program. And, clinical, treatment, counseling, with the active family involvement, participation in the 12 steps. Part of the experience was something we all know and heard of called aftercare. And aftercare was going, and after treatment, you would get together in a small group and everybody would check in with their stuff. And A started to lose newcomers. They started to wonder, where's all the newcomers coming? So when they sent AA members to find out, they said, well, people are going to aftercare, right? And I'm going to close this thing down. So people are going to aftercare programs. And so in 1964, because of the fear of losing more new members coming in slowly, in 1964, the A Grapevine put out an article suggesting groups to try a new style of speaker meeting called speaker discussion. And the meetings were molded after aftercare groups. And this was a meeting format that was never tried or tested, and no one knew if it worked or didn't work, but everyone started doing it because it was more friendly. But it was a brainchild of AA World Service to let all members, speak at meetings, even newcomers. So they basically put the hand, of the mic in the hands of newcomers or anyone who wanted to talk. So members became more dependent on meetings than the steps. And the 70s is where it was prior to Joe and Charlie. It was really a darker period in AA. A lot of people who were members then quit going to meetings, but stayed sober by the big book. But by the 80s, meetings were never the same, the ones we see. And the truth is that the power of the message of the 40s and the 60s not was not actively there as it once was. It turned into a lot of the groups. I'm not saying every meeting turned into group therapy. That means is less program talk equaled low recovery rates, and a lot of relapses, if you want to call them relapses. Are those recovery rates true that I showed? I wouldn't bet against them. I do know I tell people this, if you do the steps, you can have the 75% or the 90%. And people will ask me, and this is not a boasting thing, it's not me, it's the message. People ask me, well, what's your recovery rates working with guys? And I say the same thing my sponsor says, 100%. Because if every time I've done a book study, and I heard my grand sponsor say it too, he would say, I never known anyone to relapse that did the steps. And some guy jumps up and goes, well, wait a minute, I did the 10, I did the steps. And he goes, well, did you do step 10? No. Did you make your amends? No. Did you sponsor? No. Well, you're not doing the steps. And that's what he would say. And but I do know that, if you want 90% plus, do the steps. My good friend Derek, who was one of the founding members of Big Book Compendium, along with me and several others. On his book studies back in the 90s, he used to do a thing called Broken Kneecaps Anonymous. And I'm going to honor him by telling the story. He goes, so you break your kneecaps and you go to Broken Kneecaps Anonymous. But the problem is everyone shares about their broken kneecaps. And the problem is my kneecaps are still broken. And it sums it up right there, So I think, Howard, did you want to talk about, we're going to go over the doctor's opinion now. And I like going into that before doctor's opinion just because it shows you what Silkworth had and what we're going to see they climb to.
Well, the only thing I'll touch on was you had mentioned Clarence Snyder, and Clarence Snyder always has a special place in my heart. I love crusty old guys, and he certainly was one of them. In Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, Clarence says that trouble is that they take it so casually today. I think that a little discipline is necessary. I think AA was more effective back in those old days. Records in Cleveland show that 93%, that's in his area in Cleveland, of those who came to us never had a drink again. When I discovered that people had slips in AA, it really shook me up. Today, it's all watered down. Anyone can wander in now. I think the program is just the same. The principles are the same. The steps are the same. The practices are there and the opportunities are there. And so if you do as the big book says, then as is the same program, it was the same program that existed when I came in 1939, you'll get the same results that I did in 1939. It's simple. We're not sticking to what they did back in those days. And he goes into a lot of other things that they did about sponsorship and so on, that it's just watered down the program, but it's inevitable when the program gets larger and larger and larger that some of these things happen. That's all. I covered a lot of it last week, so I don't want to beat it into the ground.
But one thing on Joe McQuaney, when I went and did recovery dynamics training, and he was the way back, 2001. And that was for counseling, straight out of the big book. And he called the AA program today cafeteria style recovery. Choose what you want. And he says back in my day, he would say, it wasn't like that. So you want to talk about William Duncan Silkworth?
Sure, let's do that. Let's talk about good old WD. Um, William Silkworth was a neurologist, and he invested heavily in the stock market. And like most people in 1929 in the crash, lost everything. And his friend Charles Towns invited him to come to his hospital to be clinical director, to manage the hospital, to come up with some plans and so on. And by the time he wrote the doctor's opinion in 1940, he worked conservatively with about 40 to 50,000 alcoholics and addicts in that year, a 10-year period. And that's in both Towns Hospital and Knickerbocker Hospital, because he was affiliated with Knickerbocker Hospital as well. And he started to notice a couple of things. He said that, there's this group of group of drinkers who come in, and we get them fixed up physically and mentally, and we get them cleaned up and send them on their way. And in no time, they come back worse than they were before. And then there's this other group that we do the same thing to. We get them all together, we get them healthy, we get them going and send them on their way, and we never see them again. And then there's this third group of people who drink alcohol and never even wind up in a hospital as a result of it. And so we started to observe, started to notice, and come to some conclusions about this first group of drinkers, we'll call them. And he said, it seems that after they quit, when they stop, when they get cleaned up, when they get their system purged, and we'll talk about some of the interesting ways they did that, he said that the mind begins to play tricks on them, that their mind begins to remind them of the things that alcohol did for them, not the things that alcohol did to them. And even though they know what happens every time they indulge in this, eventually, in this group of people, that thought, that urge becomes so strong that it becomes an obsession. And an obsession is defined as a thought which overcomes all thoughts to the contrary. And that thought in itself triggers the ingestion of the alcohol, which sends these people off onto what he called an allergic type reaction. Allergic means abnormal, an abnormal type reaction to the ingestion of alcohol, that the more they drink, the more thirsty they get, that they're not able to just say no. And he noticed that, and he had this success, right? And when Bill was putting together the book, he got a letter from Esther Richards, who was the head of the psychiatrist in charge of the Henry Phillips Clinic at Johns Hopkins. It's a sort of outpatient clinic that they had for alcoholics back in those days. And she got a copy of the mimeographed copy of the big book that Bill had sent around to various authorities and notables and asked what they thought. And when she sent her letter back to Bill, she said, I think you should get an #1 physician who has a wide knowledge of the alcoholic problem to write an introduction, because there was no doctor's opinion. And that gave Bill the idea of turning to Dr. Silkworth and asking him if he would mind putting together this introduction, if you will. And Dr. Silkworth said he would agree to do that with 2 conditions. First condition, you call it an opinion. I don't have scientific data. I just have my experience over the last 10 years and these things I've noticed about this different group of alcoholics. So you cannot call it anything but an opinion. And the second thing, my name doesn't go on it. Because 2 years prior to the book being published, he wrote an article in the Lancet Journal, which we'll get to later, that was a British medical journal, one of the most highly regarded medical journals in the world. And he wrote this article where he laid out his beliefs about the allergic type reaction and the type of treatment that he called moral psychology, which we call spiritual awakening. But he laid out all of these things in the article, and he got lambasted that his contemporaries were talking about him being conned by all these alcoholics, that it's just nonsense. So he agreed to do it. They put the article in, didn't use his name, and he died in 1951. By 1955, when the second edition came out, the AMA, as Steve mentioned, the AMA and the American Psychiatric Association both agreed that alcoholism is, in fact, a disease, and that the things that Dr. Silkworth was saying in his original Lancet article made sense. All of a sudden, they were turning to that as kind of a source material. And so Bill then put Dr. Silkworth's name, and you apparently got approval from the family. And that's why most of the books you see today have his name signed off at the end of it. But the first editions don't. It just has ... comma MD. That's it. So before I get too deep into Dr. Silkworth's story, I'm going to leave it at that, and we'll actually start the doctor's opinion if Steve wants to.
One thing I just wanted to mention about Silkworth was, and I found really fascinating, the place he worked at where he really started understanding was, one of the ugliest hospitals in the United States was Bellevue. And was one of and they had a lot of alcoholics in there, and the governor of New York at that time thought it'd be better to put these guys in locked up. And I talked about those inebriate asylums earlier, those ugly places where they would even lobotomize alcoholics. Well, he saw that happening. But working with alcoholics, and it said he worked with 40,000 alcoholics prior to Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's a lot of people. He discovered that insufficient quality of enzymes, produced in the liver and pancreas was a result of the body not being able to break down alcohol, causing that physical reaction, which he called phenolic craving. But he's not the first guy to come up with that. I mean, we mentioned Ben Rush early on. But the difference is he couldn't break down other than saying that there was some type of loss of control. Silkworth got deep into it. I mean, he ripped the thing open, and and Silver explained what it was and what caused it. And also, it was an ugly time for people to get treatment. But I want to talk a little bit about Charles B. Towns really quick, because what I mentioned there is, he was a very interesting person. I mean, his mission was to solely treat alcoholism addiction, not recovery. And he did the belladonna treatment as a mixture of hibernane and dried berries and plants to help, basically crap everything out, so to speak, intestinal cramps and all that. It was horrible, but it was detox, and it was giving every hour on the hour, 50 hours. I mean, I'm like, God. But until the patient's face became flush and eyes went back to normal. And on top of that, he did physical therapy and exercise. And Towns Hospital, here's the part I really want to mention, and a lot of people don't talk about, is it was a place for the well-to-do. It was a drying out place for the wealthy. American millionaires, European royalty, oil sheiks, detox there. And the rooms, they look like suites. They're very fancy. And personal bathrooms, telephones. Yeah, they gave you a nice bathrobe to take home and slippers, And the cost of admission was $200, $350 for a 4-day stay. I mean, do the math nowadays at our cost. And advertising pitch was, he claimed, we hear this a lot on the info commercials at night, the cure for alcoholism. And he claimed a 90% recovery rate. And that was, debunked when he interviewed Silkworth. But Silkworth caught his eye. I mentioned he worked at 40,000 alcoholics before AA, and the 2% recovery rate. And Towns claimed he had 90%, and Silkworth supposedly laughed in his face when he said that, because he goes, "I got a 90% failure rate." And Towns also firmly believed in a psychological and mental model, but he did not believe alcoholism was an illness. But then Silkworth debunked that, and it changed Towns' stance. He basically let Silkworth run the show. He accepted the fact and handed the keys over the kingdom over to Silky, and Silkworth's his concept, it changed alcoholism forever. And when he explained it to Bill Wilson, and those words helps, we know what it did, spearhead these, AA. And if you want to find some of his stuff on silkworth.net, you'll find Manifestation of an Allergy, which is a really good breakdown deeper into the allergy, and there's also other ones in there too as well. Um, and we'll get more into Knickerbocker and all that, but the thing is with Knickerbocker, that was the first like rehab. But you know, the thing is I want to mention really quick the contributions this guy brought to AA, and because we want you to understand what we're going through. And the first contribution he brought was this allergy obsession concept. Drinking was an accepted thing, and drunkards were not. And alcoholism was considered to be a moral weakness and sin. And this was a new concept. He brought that to us, and he also, Bill was a salesman, and he was big in the third party testimonials, and he knew, like Howard mentioned, that they needed to find someone, and that's what they did. So he did that again, putting his medical reputation on the line. All this stuff did, and then you know, letting Bill sponsor. Here's this crazy guy that says, "I got the cure for alcoholism," and it's not cure, but I got the treatment for alcoholism, what do you want to call it? I got a program. He let him in there, you know. And the other thing is we'll see in Bill's story when we told Bill he's not insane. He didn't hand him a pill and said, go to sleep for a while. You know, he didn't tell him he hallucinated. He told him anything's better than what you were. And those words, and and then the other thing was, after 6 months of failing to keep anyone sober other than himself, Bill went to Silkworth and says, what am I doing wrong? And Silkworth says, what are you telling them? And talking about God. He goes, give them the hardcore medical facts. And he wound up talking to Bobson after that. And the last contribution, we go to hundreds of them, but the last contribution was when they, needed money, Silkworth helped raise almost, $4,000 from medical profession people. Again, putting his medical reputation on the line. And before we get into here, one thing I want to mention is about, many call the allergy obsession concept a disease concept. I like to call it an illness because that's what Bill said. And this is from 1960. And Bill said this in 1960. We AAers have never called alcoholism a disease because, technically speaking, it's not a disease. For example, there's no such thing as heart disease. Instead, there are many separate heart ailments and combinations of them. It is something like that with alcoholism. Therefore, we do not like to wish to get into the wrong with the medical professional by pronouncing alcoholism a disease. Hence, we have always called it an illness or a malady, a far safer term to use. So anyways, Howard, you want to start?
Yeah, just
Oh, go ahead.
a couple more things. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and I put it in the chat again. Most of you should have it from when we did this a few weeks ago. The kind of synopsis of who these guys were that came before Silkworth: Benjamin Rush and Thomas Trotter and Magnus Huss. I love that name, Magnus Huss. And Dr. Alexander Lambert, who came up with the belladonna treatment. These are all like-minded physicians that came before Silkworth. And if you want to get a little bit more information, although it'd be hard to get more information than we just threw at you in the last few minutes, you may want to try and pick up the book Silkworth, The Little Doctor Who Loved Drunks, The problem with it is it's kind of out of print and you have to buy used versions and they get expensive. But keep looking around. You could find them sometimes at a discounted rate. But if you can, try and pick it up. It's very boring and very dry the way a lot of biographies are, but it really tells you how this guy loved us, how he dedicated himself to us. And the other book is from our friend Gary, who shows up at the workshops every once in a while, King Charles of New York City. It's basically the story of Charlie Towns. And I'm not sure if Steve mentioned it, but I think one of the most fascinating things about Charlie Towns is he was an atheist. He invited Silkworth in, knowing the program that Silkworth was going to promote, because Bill Wilson had asked for permission to come back and talk to the patients. And he wholeheartedly went along with it, to the point where he was offering Bill Wilson a job to be a lay therapist at the hospital. And again, what is the program we're talking about? And how do you think an atheist would view that? And he was able, I think our history is so filled with extraordinarily humble doctors like Dr. Silkworth, who was able to put aside the things that he thought he knew and go along with what he saw that was working. And doctors like Charles and so on, although he wasn't a doctor, he still believed in that. There was one other thing that I wanted to mention, and I'm just trying to complete blank, so I'm sure we'll come back to it later. Let's get started in the chapter. Go ahead.
One thing I like to say too is, this is from my personal experience, this doctor's opinion, and people will disagree, especially in other fellowships. This is very universal, I believe. I mean, this whole allergy thing. And so anyways, let's get into this. It's XXV, I believe. And I don't know what the third edition number would be, but in case you have a third edition, but so we're in Docker's opinion. Now,
XX is
go
in the
ahead.
fourth edition. The XXV is in the fourth edition. In the first edition, you got XXIII.
Right. And then so he says, to whom it may concern, and I put my name there, you know, I have specialized in the treatment of alcoholism for many years. I believe it was 38 years at the time.
Well, at the time, the date on the letter, he took off the date. The actual letter bears the date. It was July 27th, 1938. So at that point, he'd been there for over about 10, 12 years at that point. At that point, when he wrote this in 1938, because he came to work for the hospital around 1930, right after the crash. 29 and 30. So by 38, which is when he dated this article.
So it says in 1934, I attended a patient, which is Bill, who thought he had been a competent businessman of good earning capacity, was an alcoholic of a type I have come to regard as hopeless. That's a big word right there. And hopeless is something impossible to solve. But one thing doctors tried to avoid back then was telling someone they were hopeless. I explain, I don't need to explain again about the pine box thing, you know, hopeless condition of mind and body. So it says, in the course of his third treatment, so like some of us, we went to multiple rehab, so did Bill. He acquired certain ideas, certain spiritual ideas, concerning a possible means of recovery. Now, he didn't say abstinence, he didn't say dryness or whatever, he says recovery. I don't think that was a word too often uttered back then. This is from a doctor. Again, remember, he's putting his medical reputation on the line. As part of his, here's another big word, rehabilitation. He commenced to present his conceptions to other alcoholics. Look at this, impressing upon them they must, there's the first must I know in this, must do likewise with still others. I think the book has 100, and I forget, 103 must in it, whatever, but what is a must? So it's an essential requirement, something that's so important it can't be missed or ignored or neglected. Absolutely necessary. He said we must. So he's telling us we must. So Is it a requirement to work with others? What do you think, Howard?
I think it's probably a good idea.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's like pulling the ripcord on a parachute, it'd probably be a good suggestion.
yeah, definitely. And uh, and it said, look what it says now. It says this has become the basis of a rapid going fellowship. So if you back up, he said they must likewise with others. So the basis of that fellowship was helping others. That was what's the basis, like what's the basis of your program? What's the basis of AA now? Is it this? Look at now he goes on more. This man and over 100 others appear to have recovered. So, this basis of this rapidly growing fellowship was working with other alcoholics, passing on the exact same spiritual ideas without being mixed up. That was the basis of, in another word, for basis is foundation. That's the foundation. It's not the foundation we see too much anymore, you know, and what's the basis of, again, I always tell people, what's the basis of recovery? How many the meetings or how many fifth steps you heard? How many people you taken to the steps? How many of you led to, have you assisted leading to an awakening? You in the bold statement, he says, you know, that it's by a doctor, and he's saying they recovered, who has worked with 40,000 alcoholics with a 2% recovery rate. If he was put in front of this thing at the right, I mean, could you imagine how amazed he was? All of a sudden he goes, he's been hoping or praying for something to happen. That's why he never gave up on us. And it was brought to him. Over 100 have recovered. So in 38 years, this guy saw 800 people recover out of 40,000 that he worked with up to that point. And then in less than a year, he sees 100 recover. So in 38 years, saw 800 that he didn't think were alcoholics. In less than a year, 100. Do you think he was a little bit like awestruck and blown away? So, anything you want to say on that, Howard?
Yeah, beginning of the paragraph, a couple of things. First of all, before the letter, I want to make note of something. There's the lead into the letter that Bill Wilson wrote to introduce Dr. Silkworth. And the last sentence says that a well-known doctor, chief physician in a nationally prominent hospital specializing in alcoholic and drug addiction, gave Alcoholics Anonymous. What I want you to take note of is the next two words, this letter. It doesn't say these letters. It says this letter. So that means that what follows in these next few pages, among other things, is a letter, not two letters, one letter. And in the paragraph that Steve had just mentioned, he talked about in the course of his third treatment. He's talking about Bill Wilson, who had at the time, by the time he sobered up, been in the hospital that we can verify 4 times. For those of you keeping count and want to keep track, the first visit was probably late summer 1933. His second visit was early summer, probably July 1934. So he went for a year between treatments. And then in his third visit was early fall 1934. And between that third visit and his final visit, which is December of 34, something happened. That's what he's referring to, that in the course of his third treatment, between the third and the fourth treatment, he acquired certain ideas concerning a possible means of recovery. And what happened is Ebby Thatcher appeared. His friend, the worst alcoholic he ever met, and we'll talk about Ebby more, I'm sure, as we go along, had shown up on his doorstep and was sober a few months. And Ebby was the worst alcoholic Bill ever met. He said, if I ever got as bad as him, I have to quit. I couldn't go on living like that. And here he was, living, breathing proof. And he told Bill about how he had gotten sober through the Oxford groups of the day. And the word Oxford groups doesn't appear in the first edition, because of some other reasons, which we can get into later, not that important at the moment. But the point is that he told Bill about this method, this religious method that he had applied, and he told him what the methods were. And he said, look what happened. I've used their what they considered their steps. I've had this spiritual awakening, and I haven't had a drink in 3 months. Look at me, Bill. And it wasn't just that, like it said earlier in Bill's story, later on Bill's story, there was something about his eyes. You know, the eyes are the window of the soul. It was not just his eyes. His suit was pressed, his shoes were shined. There was something different about Ebby Thatcher when he showed up that day. And that's what we're talking about here, that in the course of his third treatment, between that third and the fourth treatment, he ran into Ebby. And as a result of that, he sobered up and he asked to present his conceptions to other patients at the hospital, which is an extraordinary request. And even more extraordinary is the answer he got, which was yes, they allowed him to come in. A guy who had been in the hospital 4 times over the past 2 years, who now had accumulated somehow a couple of weeks or months of sobriety. They're opening the door and letting him come in to talk to their current patients. And let me just end with what the sentence on the paragraph that Steve read ends with. It says, this man and over 100 others appeared to have recovered. I'm going to ask that you underline that, and next to it, write the words fact number 1. And I'll explain why after Steve goes through the next part. Go ahead, Steve.
It says I personally know scores, and I believe that's 20 of cases who were of the type with whom other methods fail completely. Again, a little blown away, right? Because these facts to be of extreme medical importance because of the extraordinary possibilities of rapid growth inherent in this group. They may mark a new epoch, which means new era in the annals of alcoholism. So it's interesting what he says there. It's small. He's just anticipating that it's going to get big. He's really pushing it, and he knew something. And these men may well have a remedy of 1,000 situations. He knew we're on to something. He knew it. He says you may rely absolutely on anything they say about themselves. When he just said alcohol, you can rely on anything alcoholic says. The old saying was, "An alcoholic lying when their mouth's moving," but that's a hell of an endorsement right there he gives us. You may rely on everything we say about themselves. It comes from a doctor, and a very good one. And yet, people in the fellowship, for like if I'm speaking out of the book, they say, take what you want and leave the rest. Stuff like that. I'm glad this guy didn't do that. And it says, very truly yours, William D. Silkworth, William Duncan Silkworth, MD. Do you want to comment on that at all, Howard? You want me to keep going?
Sure. Yeah. The line you had pinpointed, you may rely absolutely on anything they say about themselves. We're not talking about the guy you sit next to at the meeting that you go to every week, who says all the cool things, the funny expressions, the Gucciisms, and then the rest of the meeting, all he's doing is whispering in your ear and character assassinating everybody else in the room. We're not talking about that guy. He's saying you can rely absolutely on what the people who wrote this book have to say about themselves. And it's an interesting look at Bill Wilson's sense of humor, because if we look at the first paragraph that we didn't really read, was Bill introducing Dr. Silkworth. And he says that this man had treated so many others. He's an expert in alcoholism. You can believe anything he has to say. So here he is, folks, William D. Silkworth, and he introduces Silky. And what does Silky say? You can rely absolutely on everything Bill Wilson has to say. So Bill introduces him so he can toss the ball back to Bill Wilson. But I also want to draw your attention to something I mentioned a moment ago. It says, this man and over 100 others appear to have recovered. Remember, we wrote fact number 1. The next paragraph says, I personally know scores of others who had of the type who had, please underline, other methods had failed completely. Please underline that. And next to that, write fact 2. And then the next paragraph might make a little bit more sense. He said, these facts, again, what are the facts? The fact is that this man and over 100 others appear to have recovered, a word that wasn't used and applied, as Steve mentioned before, and it is widely being used at that point. But he said the fact number 1 is that this guy and 100 others appear to have recovered. And the second fact is they've tried everything else and everything else failed. And those facts themselves should be of extreme importance to those of us in the medical community because of the possibilities that we can apply this to what he said, the remedy for thousands of such alcoholics. I like to change that word thousands to millions because it probably was then, but it definitely is now a problem of millions and not thousands. And then he says you can rely absolutely on anything they have to say about themselves. That's the first letter. Remember, I draw your attention to the fact that he said he gave Alcoholics Anonymous this letter. We just read this letter. What we're about to read is what I call the connective tissue between the letter and the statement, because there are two different things. There's no two letters here. People always refer to the second part of this as the second letter. It's not a letter. Letters begin the way Steve read with to whom it may concern. The next section does not begin like that. There's no signature at the end of it. It is a statement. It is not a letter. And he mentions it twice in the very first paragraph we're about to read. So it's not just an opinion. He mentioned it, that I'm referring to incidentally what Steve is about to read. If we do get into it, this is Bill Wilson again, speaking about the connection between the first part, which is the letter, and the second part, which is the statement. Now, I don't know if we want to go further than that now, but
Well,
that's just,
let's go to it now, and we got time. So it says, the physician who, at our request, gave us this letter, has been kind enough to enlarge upon his views and another statement that follows. In this statement, he confirms that we have had alcohol, that we who have suffered alcoholic torture must, there's that word again, must believe that the body of the alcohol is quite as abnormal as the mind. So one thing I want to point out about that is alcoholics, in insane asylums, were told you're mentally ill because they looked at alcoholics as a mental problem only. What Silkworth discovered, that there's a abnormal part of the body, and a brand new radical concept. It's like, and they're discovering that about a lot of diseases nowadays, that they say, oh, you got to treat them here, and they're, stem cell research, all this stuff to replace things. And this was radical. Let's see what else it says. It did not satisfy. They told us, now this is very important because they tell these guys you're crazy, you're a sinner, it did not satisfy us, which means they didn't feel 100%, to be told that we could not control our drinking just because we were maladjusted to life. They couldn't adjust. You can adjust to life, that's why you drink. That we were full fright from reality, outright mental defectives. Maybe all of those, but that's not why we drink, right? Right there, that's the old diagnosis of alcoholism from the insane asylums. You're maladjusted life, full fight from reality, you're an outright mental defect. That's the old diagnosis. You're insane. He's crazy, put him in the rubber room, lock the door, throw away the key. You see why these guys got lost in the institutional system, where alcoholics were lost in there? there was so many alcoholics in in the institutional system in those days that they would even lose their names and they would just make up an illness and a name around them. It was a controversial thing that happened in the 50s. And, you know, why don't we, you want to stop there and then where did Howard go?
Yeah,
Whether,
yeah, it is, boss.
yeah,
Um, yeah, I think we could stop there. I just put in the chat if anyone's interested. If you've read the doctor's opinion, you know there's a point in a little while where he says that I believe and so suggested a few years ago. He's referring to that article that I made mention of in the Lancet Journal called Reclamation of the Alcoholic, that laid out these beliefs that kind of got him lambasted. And I put that in the chat. What I'm going to put in next week at the beginning of the meeting is the actual rewritten statement that he gave to Bill, that Bill rewrote into what we now know as the second letter, or actually the statement. And as Steve just read, that very first paragraph of this connective tissue tells you what you're about to read. It's not a letter. He says it has been kind enough to enlarge his views in another statement, which follows. And in case you missed it the first time, he says, in this statement, at no point does he refer to the next point as a letter. And I know it's really pedantic and maybe even anal to make such a hard, fast point to that. But it's just that every time someone refers to that second part as a second letter, it kind of irks me because we're not reading the book. The book says it's a statement, it's not a letter. And we'll get into that next week. So I'm going to step aside and leave it to you to close it out.
well, you know, so as you know, we're getting our nails dirty in step one, you know, and one of the most amazing quotes from the father of the Tao, Latous, said, "The journey of 1,000 miles begins with one single step." It's ironic, you know, this is our journey of 1,000 miles, and if you know if you've been cleaning 2 weeks or 2 years or 20 years or 30 years, you're gonna look back and go, or 2 days, your journey of 1,000 miles begins with that single step. So we're gonna close it out and we'll do some discussion in here. Oops. Let me see. Hold on. My thing's being crazy. I almost turned the meeting off.